Good morning and welcome to the little apartment on the prairie. I am making bread today. I've been saying for a long time I wanted to do a video making bread, and today is the day. So I'm starting out with one and a half cups of very warm but not hot water. And I'm adding to that half a tablespoon of dry active yeast. Now, I make sourdough bread with a sourdough starter, and some people are going to tell you that you're not supposed to add yeast. It's not really sourdough bread if you add yeast. I add half a tablespoon of yeast because it makes my results more consistent, helps the bread rise more consistently. I can make this bread with less yeast or with no yeast. It's going to take it longer to rise, and your results, it's going to be trickier to work with. So that's why I use a little bit of yeast. And I started out with more yeast and found that I can use half a tablespoon and I get the results that I want. So you want to stir it till that yeast is all the way dissolved, which is going to take a minute. Back during the pandemic, when there was a yeast shortage and I was running out of yeast, I made the bread with less yeast. I've made it with no yeast. This is how it turns out better for me. So you're going to have kind of a milky looking liquid when it's stirred in. And then I'm going to let it sit for like 5 or 10 minutes and let that yeast start working before I do anything else to it. So the first part, the bread's easy to make, but the first part takes a few minutes because you're going to do that. You're going to mix your yeast in your water, then you're going to wait a few minutes. So I'll be back in a few minutes when it's time for the next step. Alright, so after that sits for 5 minutes or so, the next step is to add a cup of sourdough starter. My sourdough starter mostly lives on the back of my stove in a jar. It's got a piece of calico cloth that covers the top of it. There's no lid on there, so it gets air. If you're gonna not be using it for a while, you can put your starter in the fridge and it's fine. So I don't know how well you can see what this looks like. It's kind of bubbly. It definitely smells like sourdough. I'm gonna add a cup. It's pretty thick but pourable. And I'm going to pour that in there. And this is what makes it sourdough bread. It's what gives it its unique taste and smell. And here's an interesting thing about sourdough. It picks up, like I've used this starter now, the same starter. I mean, you add more. I'm going to add more flour and water to it, and you just keep using it. And I've had this starter for more than 3 years now. And it picks up like the unique yeast that's in your environment and on your skin. And so even if I gave you some of my starter, after you used it for a little while, it would be different than the starter that I have in my house because it picks up the unique yeast from its environment. So I'm going to stir it up. You can see it's bubbly? And then I'm going to give it 10 or 15 minutes to let it work. And in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, since I used half a cup of starter, I'm going to put half a cup of flour and half a cup of water back in that starter and stir it up and set it back on the back of the stove. And in a few days, when I'm ready to make bread again, it'll be ready to go. You can make your own starter if you're interested in using sourdough, or you can get a starter from somebody who already has one. If you want to make your own, you can find all kinds of instructions on the internet, but you basically just need flour and water, and you mix it, you let it sit, you have to feed it more flour and water periodically. Some recipes tell you to like pour some of it off and then add more. Some of it don't have you discarding any, but you can make your own starter And it takes about a week and then you're ready to go. I made mine off a recipe that I found on the internet, and I went with the simplest recipe I could find. And that's it. It's easy. You can make all kinds of things, not just bread. You can make pizza crust, you can make pretzels, you can make cinnamon rolls. I have a recipe for an applesauce spice cake that uses sourdough, and it's really good. All right, so we're gonna let that sit for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and finish up making the dough. All right, so after you've given it 10 or 15 minutes to get all bubbly, you're gonna come back to it. You're gonna add 2 tablespoons of sugar. And not only does the sugar help the bread taste good, it helps feed the yeast, so it gets that yeast going. And then you're going to add 2 teaspoons of salt. Teaspoon. And I love this recipe because it doesn't have a lot of ingredients. You've got yeast, sourdough, water, flour, salt, sugar, and baking soda. The baking soda you add in later. It's a really simple recipe. I'm going to stir that, and then I'm going to add 4 cups of flour. I'm bending down because my flour is in a big bin that slides under my kitchen table, and I slide it out when I need to get to it. So I buy flour in 25-pound bags. It's cheaper that way, and I bake bread once or twice a week, and then I bake other things, so I do go through that much flour. I love this measuring cup. I got it at an antique store. All right, so then you're just going to stir. And it's going to get kind of thick and hard to stir. Sometimes it works better to just stick your hands in there and knead it with your hands, but it's going to be sticky. You're just going to stir till you've got a dough. You've incorporated all the flour in it. It'll kind of be a little bubbly. It'll smell like sourdough. And then when you're done, you're going to cover it up with a cloth. Put it in a warm but not hot place. I'm just going to set mine on my stove and let it rise until it's about doubled in size. That's going to take anywhere from like an hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on stuff like the room temperature, the humidity, how your sourdough is acting that day. That's why I say I add yeast to it a little bit, because it helps it be more consistent, and this is more consistent. If you're making it without any yeast, it's probably going to take the 3 hours, and it's going to be trickier. So we'll come back in a few hours when you want it to about double in size. We'll come back then, and that's when we knead it and shape it into loaves. Okay, it's been about 2 hours, and our bread dough has about doubled in size. And so I need some flour here. The next ingredients we add are going to be 2 teaspoons of baking soda and between 1/2 and 1 cup of flour, which I'm dipping out from this bin under my table. I say 1/2 cup to 1 cup because it's going to depend on how sticky your dough is and what ends up working best for you. So I'm going to get some flour on my hands. See, can you see here? There we go. And I'm just going to dump this dough out on the flour. I knead my dough. I put it on a cookie sheet because it contains the flour and the mess. You know, you can do it on a big cutting board or whatever works for you. So I'm going to get some baking soda. Grab a measuring spoon. 2 teaspoons of baking soda, and I'm just going to kind of dump it right here on the dough, and then I'm going to knead the dough and mix the baking soda in. I've got about 1/2 cup of flour down here. Super sassy, she's chasing whiskers. So I'm just going to knead the dough and mix that baking soda in. And I'm going to start incorporating about 1/2 cup of flour into this dough, and then I'll add more if I need to if it's still sticky. If your dough's sticky, you need more flour. And I just kind of fold it over and squish it down. Fold it over, squish it down. And you do that a whole bunch. And if you do it enough, you feel it in your back muscles. A couple years ago, I sold bread at the farmer's market, and I would bake like a dozen loaves of bread on Friday to sell on Saturday. And man, I felt it in my arms and in my back. You wouldn't think baking bread was strenuous work, but I sure felt it. My kitchen's a mess now because I've been cooking today. I had it all cleaned up this morning when I started baking bread, but by now it's a mess because I've been cooking. I'm making this casserole that I found a recipe for online. We'll see how it turns out. It sounded good. It had like cottage cheese and sour cream in it and pasta. And it's going to make a big casserole dish, so I'll have leftovers for a long time. Okay, so your dough's gonna, it's gonna kind of be smooth. It's gonna feel elastic. You'll be able to feel air bubbles in it. And then you're gonna kind of divide the dough into 2 sections because this recipe makes 2 loaves. So I divide them, try to get them even. Might need a little bit more over here. Get them as even as I can. I usually end up with one loaf turns out bigger than the other. Get a little more flour. Knead it a little bit more and shape it into a loaf. Now I do loaf shaped. I'll show you how I make my loaves. Other people do them neater than I do. You can also just make it into a ball and have a ball of bread if you want. I kind of flatten it out into a rectangle. Then I roll it up. Kind of roll it out like you would do Play-Doh or something. And I just leave the ends kind of, I don't really do anything to my ends. And then you're going to put it in a loaf pan and do the other half of the bread dough. Spray your loaf pans with like Pam, or I use the generic, but some kind of baking spray. I never have a problem with this bread sticking to pans. Just flatten it out. And roll it up. Like I said, there's different ways you can shape your dough into loaves you can find online. Alright, so then I've got bread dough in 2 loaf pans. I'm going to cover that with my cloth. Set it in a warm but not hot place. It's on top of my stove right now while my casserole's in the oven. And let it rise. It'll about double in size. It usually takes it about an hour, give or take a little bit. So we'll be back and see what it looks like when it's done rising. Okay, it's a little over an hour later and the bread has about doubled in size. Hold on, let me show you. There's our bread. And I'm going to bake it in a 400-degree oven for 25 minutes. So it's going in now. Sassy, get out of the way. All right. And in 25 minutes, I will show you what it looks like when it comes out of the oven. And 25 minutes has passed. So let's see what our bread looks like. Let me turn this. You see? Ouch, it's hot. Imagine that bread right out of the oven is hot. Right? All right. There you go. That's my homemade sourdough bread. I do that once or twice a week, every week. I hope you all are having a good weekend, and I will see you soon.